Hi everyone, welcome to lecture guide number 4. This lecture is on photography in 19th, kind of mid-19th to early 20th century documentation, which is a question we'll keep kind of returning to in future weeks here about the way that photography was used as a document or as a report of some kind of conditions in the world. You will have hopefully gone through the readings. That Solomon Godot reading is very important to understanding some of the nuances of documentation. And while she doesn't talk about this particular subject, the Civil War and landscape photography of the time, certainly her ideas are applicable to this and will set the ground for, again, future lectures on this subject. So, as many of the readings have pointed out, photography had always had this connection, as we have talked about, to the real, to some kind of connection to whatever you put in front of the camera. There was a almost objective recording of that thing that is in front of the camera. And so in some ways, it's really not on the minds of a lot of photographers or people who are consuming photography in the 19th century to even need to raise the question of whether they are documents. In fact, the very term documentary and documentation is primarily an early 20th century application to photography, and that should tell you something. First, it should tell you that, as soon as someone has to argue that a photograph is a document, that means that probably a lot of people are starting to question in what ways a photograph is a documentation, or again, documentation and documentary are terms that today we should treat with a lot of nuances, a lot of gray areas, but oftentimes I think we think when someone says this is a documentary, it's an accurate, objective, not subjective recording of a truth that exists out there in the world. And we're going to try to make that a little bit more complex. And the reason that I like to focus in on this is not only is it a recurrent question in photography, in other words, what is the connection between a photograph and the real or truth, but it's also something that can help you to navigate a world that today is increasingly saturated by photographic media, which are always trying to claim a certain validity and truth. I mean, I don't know the number of times I've seen a photograph used to push a particular ideological position. And I also know, and I want to be very careful about this in my own life, that I tend to be quite convinced by photographs that already prove the point of view that I have in my mind. Not that you need to know this, but my leanings are to the left. I'm not particularly inclined to believe very conservative views, and if I see a photograph that inclines towards the left, I tend to find it more believable than a photograph that pushes me in another direction. And I don't like that, right? I want to not be in an echo chamber in which only my views are reported back to me, not only be convinced by things that confirm my view of reality, but also be, thinking about all of the different possibilities of truths and representations of the events that are out there in the world. So I'd like you to be thinking about all the way through this and all the way through this class, is that photographs are representations that have a particular claim to truth because they start as an indexical sign at some level, right? Or at least they used to before digital photography, which can kind of represent anything. But then again, we might even say that all these composite photographs were just early forms of what can do with digital photography, just perhaps less convincing. In other words, representations are representations of something that exists in the world or ideas that are out there. And it's in the representation part that we should really pay attention. As soon as you represent something or represent something, there is a space for ideology, for particular viewpoints and perspectives and belief systems to enter into the photographic record. Whether that exists in advance, by which I mean that when you photograph a particular subject, it is inclined to be thought of in particular ways by the right and left and all the nuances in between. In other words, if you photograph a homeless person, certain already prevalent views in society will make some people think of it one way and other people think of it another way. Whether you think of a photograph as being coded at the level of a photographer making choices in what he or she represents in the photograph, in other words, selective focus, cropping off images, taking a particular perspective, getting a particular emotional expression, all of those are choices that are being made that are coded. We will understand them in particular ways. They're visual signs. They are iconic signs that are connected to all of the other signs that exist out there in the world. But then again, you might even think, and this is, just three of many, many possibilities of thinking your way through documentaries, that, of course, the way that these images are consumed, where they are circulated, where you encounter them, has a big impact on what they will mean. In other words, if you find them on your Facebook page or, Instagram or Twitter or whatever, that might be quite different than if you encounter them in the New York Times or in the Wall Street Journal or in a documentary program produced by PBS or whatever. These things are all going to lend particular nuances to these photographs. And so we're going to start this story thinking about the way that photographs were used to represent disasters. First, very briefly, in the Crimean War, and then more in a more detailed way in the photographs that were circulated and taken of the Civil War in the United States, that is. So let's start the story with Roger Fenton. Roger Fenton was he started as an art photographer. He's actually taught a little bit and participated in projects that were completed by some of the French photographers that you already saw, Charles Negre, Legray, Lessec, and others who were documenting various things in Paris. We didn't get into these things. But he was trained as an art photographer. He knew a lot about aesthetics at the time. And when the Crimean War broke out, which is a war between kind of Britain and various allied powers and Russia at the time, Roger Fenton was sent by Thomas Agnew, who was a Manchester reporter, to the war to take photographs. After all, people are starting to think, well, you can use photography in order to give people more information about various historical events that are going on. But he also thought, as of course you have to have in the back of your mind all the way through this story, that photography would be a way to increase sales of newspapers. I mean, photography is relatively new. We can use these photographs in order to increase newspaper sales. Here's the thing, and I'll probably forget to say this all the way through, but you have to keep in mind something really peculiar at this moment that isn't going to immediately register for you, which is that photography could not be accurately reprinted in a newspaper immediately. What you would have to do is go through a very long process of taking a photographic negative, turning it into basically an engraving, or engraving or an etching, which is another way to do it, especially at this time, and then reprinting these in very, very kind of deteriorated form, usually weeks, if not months later in a newspaper. It took that long to do all of this stuff. Now, around the beginning of the 20th century, they'll come up with the halftone process, which is a quicker process, but it just deteriorates the image down to almost nothing. So it's not like today where it's, someone can send in a digital photograph at 6 p.m. and it can make the next day's headlines. These things took forever, and they weren't very useful for, let's say, newspapers themselves in the way that we would think of them today. So they tended to end up doing is show up in things like weekly magazines, later on in The Civil War, we'll see them show up in Harper's Weekly, but again, they have to be turned into prints in order to be reproduced in these magazines, so they don't have that same fidelity. That's one of the ways they're circulated. In any case, so Roger Fenton here is sent off to the Crimean War, off in Crimea, so the northern kind of territories of what is today still Russia, very kind of desolate landscape, and he, has to deal with taking photographs of a war scene. Now, the problem is, of course, that at this stage, he's using salted paper negatives, which is part of that early, basically, calotype process that is quite slow when it comes to both exposure times so you can't get any really, anything that's an action scene is out of the question. You're not going to get that. And you're in a war, so how are you going to deal with this? And what he ended up doing is taking these pictures of basically, the landscape with very little action occurring. After all, I should say this as well, that the Crimean War wasn't kind of hand-to-hand combat so much as it was two sides launching artillery, meaning cannonballs at each other from distances away, without getting into any huge bloody conflicts. So this is one of the most famous photographs of that scene. Not a lot of action going on. It's called Valley of the Shadow of Death from 1855, and all those little balls you see there are cannonballs strewn all over the landscape. He can't capture the sound, which was apparently really, really loud concussions. He can't capture even the amount of cannonballs that just keep coming in. He can only show you what is left over here, kind of the remnants of that scene. It was also the case that he had a photographic van. Here it is. That was his mobile darkroom, and when he would take this out into the field, the Russians would target it, right? They would go after it with cannonballs, so that wasn't very fun for him, and he very quickly decided, it wasn't worth it to get out there in the field and get these pictures of just cannonballs on the ground anyway. And the conditions were horrible. It was really hot. It's this kind of blasted landscape, incredibly saturated light, so you can't see anything. And of course, this overexposes all of his negatives. As he once put it here, quote, "The Russians fired constantly. The ground here is covered with cannonballs. I could hear by the whir and thud that the balls were coming up the ravine on each side. The 68-pounders especially almost burst the ear. The awful clangor, as if hell had broken loose and legions of Lucifer were fighting in the air." Now, I'm not sure that this photograph can capture that, right? It can give you a little indication of what the landscape looked like, and that's about it. Again, the severe light, the horrible conditions, hot, flies, war, led him to come up with some fairly simple solutions. The first one was he decided that because he couldn't get action shots, really, he would pose officers for basically portraits and send these back. These are kind of the heroic scenes of men waiting to go into battle. Because the light was so severe, he had to wake them up at 4 a.m. in the morning to get them to pose for these scenes. Again, he would show the battlements, so huge cannons being packed and ready for firing. After all, at this stage, the financial backers of this project wanted to push the idea that, of course, Great Britain was in the right and they were a powerful force fighting for right against this, Russian ancient monarchy that was all in the wrong. They didn't want any photographs of the dead, obviously, that would show the conflict as actually incurring some kind of sacrifice by people. They wanted to drum up support for a war, basically, that wasn't very popular in Great Britain at the time by showing heroism. So, show artillery, show officers in all of their finery, right? Heroic scenes. It was a huge financial disaster, and in the end, what it leaves for us is the problem of how you could use this early photography as a documentation of something like war. If we return to the United States, and remember Mathew Brady, this is a man who had already had a very successful career as a portrait daguerreotypist. He had cornered the market in some ways on celebrity portraits, the famous American series, for instance, which were carte de visite. And when the Civil War broke out in April of 1861, Mathew Brady and many other photographers saw this as a chance to make money. For those of you who don't know, the American Civil War, of course, was fought between the northern states and the southern states based upon, at least in large part, slavery, whether slavery was going to be outright condemned and not allowed to persist or allowed to continue. And one of the precipitating events of the Civil War was the possibility of new states coming into the Union, particularly California, which would sway and, sway the sentiment against slavery. The abolitionists would have the upper hand in this, it led to the South basically seceding from the Union. So most people at the time really believed it would be a very short war, that the North would step in no time would win this war and show the Southerners who was who. And in the end, of course, most of us know that's not at all what happened. Over the course of the 4+ years that the Civil War raged on, there were almost 3 million soldiers involved, and almost 1 million soldiers died during the Civil War. So a quite bloody Civil War. Most of the in fact, all of the photographs that you're going to be seeing here are photographs that were taken by northern photographers. And so in the background of all of these photographs is an ideological position that is meant to promote the ideas of the North winning, promote the idea that the North is right. Even when you see scenes of, the dead, the emphasis is on the sacrifice that is made by the North in order to ensure its ideological position. Now, Mathew Brady he immediately started what he called, what was the name of it? Matthew Brady's National Photographic Art Gallery, and then, gathered around him a number of important photographers who had already had a lot of training in portraiture to head out to the war and be his cameraman. Brady's main cameraman early on was Timothy H. O'Sullivan, who we'll see not only in the Civil War pictures, but also in pictures of the natural landscape of the United States. Now, he doesn't quite know how this photography is going to be used when they first go out. After all, it can't really be reproduced in newspapers. It can be reproduced as a print in Harper's Weekly, which some of these photographs were, although the more graphic photographs, Harper's Weekly didn't want. They wanted photographs that were pretty sedate. No one wanted to see the dead and all the reality that a photograph with all of its detail can give us, after all. And so Brady took photographs, especially early on, of celebrity generals, their staff. You saw the picture earlier on of Abraham Lincoln showing up to support the troops and so forth, and then had these reproduced as carte de visite that he tried to sell. Now, by the end of the war, he had over 7,000 negatives, which was a huge cost, of course, and made zero money off of this, and was only kind of saved from bankruptcy when the government gave him a stipend of $25,000 for his effort. So, how would these things work? Again, you would have a traveling basically dark room in order to develop your negatives in the field. These are basically covered wagons. They would also carry all the very heavy photographic equipment. So here's just a photograph of one of those picture wagons, and many of them were sent out into the field at this time. Again, Mathew Brady's primary approach was to photograph, and this is what he was good at, portraits of the generals. So this is General Sherman, of course, in the middle, and Sherman was, of course, famous for his march through the South, which still has people in the South pretty angry with him. He was basically kind of burn everything as you go type of general. And his staff, it's just a typical kind of portrait, right? These are all reproducible. They're all, at this point, wet plate process, which would have to be administered in the field. You'd have to doctor the plates before you actually expose them. Another one, again, just General McLaughlin and his staff in 1861. You can probably tell these look like, frankly, you would, find paintings looking this way, with very clear compositions, everyone framed by the edges. The flag itself, which is being used here to create a kind of pyramidal composition that was very familiar from painting, and the inclusion of a black man to the left of the foreground to let you know what all of this was being fought over. Lincoln on the battlefield of Antietam. Antietam was the first major bloody conflict of the war, and we don't see any of that in Brady's photograph here. You see Lincoln in the middle, the pyramidal composition, using the tent in the background to emphasize that, flanked by two mirror images of the supporting cast of Lincoln here. In other words, we've got a very balanced, very symmetrical composition. And it's all about, showing these famous heroes that he thought he could sell primarily as carte de visite. Now, there were scenes of the dead, and these were fairly controversial at the time. Any of you who have seen some of the great documentaries on the Civil War will have seen a million of these photographs of the war dead. It was the first largely photographed war, but the problem was, what were you going to do with these photographs? After all, from the side of the North, you really didn't want to see the dead because it would remind you of how many of your own dead there were out there. And frankly, war is such a graphic thing that when you see it, whether it's showing you the other side dying or your side dying, it just kind of emphasizes how horrible wars are. Now, you can probably tell in this dead Confederate soldier picture from 1865, so very late on in the war, that this is not likely the way that this scene really looked, just like those. In other words, if you were to come across it in the field, it seems unlikely this is how this would look here. The two guns are posed very obviously. The camera has taken a pretty balanced view of the picture, and that will become, one of the standard forms at this time. As a matter of fact, no one at this time believed that a photograph, with maybe the exception of Timothy O'Sullivan, believed that a photograph should just accurately record what you came across in the field. As you will have heard in the readings, these photographers, conditioned by the way that, frankly, painting worked, wanted to provide a narrative, tell a story through the photographs. And they tried to do that both visually as well as accompanying many of these photographs when they were reproduced in limited edition folios, such as, we'll see this in a minute, Gardner's photographic sketchbook of the war, with stories, with narratives, very highly fictionalized accounts. And so just about everything that you're seeing here is not only a photographer making a decision about, for instance, which side of the dead he is going to show, the Confederates or the Union dead, and almost always it'll be Confederates. from what angle he's going to show them. He will usually manipulate the scene, including, again here, probably putting this log across to give you a kind of balancing form and to focus you in on the dead, balancing these rifles against one another, both of them kind of paralleling one another to create a more pleasing composition. He may even include things in the scene that weren't there, bringing in skulls or bringing in more guns or what have you. And then after this is photographed, of course, it's the consumption that we want to be thinking about as well. Where were these things shown? Again, there were carte de visite portraits of soldiers. These could be reproduced by the soldiers themselves and sent home to their loved ones, or they could be of the heroes. There are war scenes such as this that could be sold both to Harper's Weekly or reproduced in kind of limited folio books, or be sold as carte de visite, believe it or not. There were stereo cards of these scenes that people could really see the action up close, and prominently what we are going to focus on are the limited edition books that were produced of these scenes. So what did people expect to see of the Civil War? Well, this is a Winslow Homer painting called Rainy Day at Camp. Winslow Homer got famous for doing these paintings and then having these turned into prints and reproduced in Harper's Weekly. And of course, what he's showing you are the soldiers sitting around, just as you saw in some of the photographs of the Crimean War, for instance, in between battles. There's no conflict being shown. It's just meant to be, a scene that gives you a sense of the difficulty of the life without showing you the graphic details. Photographs, of course, if you're going to take them of the actual war, are going to be so shot through, so overabundant in the details, those graphic details of the gruesome nature of war, that the public really didn't necessarily want to see those. So what to do with those? Again, a few more from Mathew Brady. These are, again, Union soldiers would have themselves photographed, and these could be turned into, there's multiple different ways that these could be photographed as a daguerreotype, but more dominantly as a tintype, a cheaper form, or even a carte de visite that you could create multiple different copies of this and send it home in letters to your loved ones. And here's some examples of these. These are heroic portraits, so more famous people in the carte de visite. Stereographs, right? So you could get a sense of what it actually looked like. If this doesn't remind you of the Winslow Homer I just showed you, take another look at them, right? People sitting around waiting for the next battle to occur. One of the most interesting photographers for me of this moment is Alexander Gardner, who was initially hired by Mathew Brady, and he was in charge of Brady's Washington, D.C. studio. He was a master at the wet plate process, and he basically got a very, very high-powered duo, a company run by, you don't need to know their name, to print and distribute the pictures of officers and soldiers with the inscription Brady's National Photographic Art Gallery on every single one of them for Brady himself. But after a while, Alexander Gardner and many of the photographers that were employed by Brady got, let's say, a bit frustrated with Brady's needing to put his imprimatur on every single thing he produced and giving none of the copyrights to the photographers themselves, basically just treating them as operators of a photograph. And he will eventually open his own studio in 1863, taking many of the top photographers away from Brady. Alexander Gardner was out in the field at Antietam in 1862, the first major war that was run by General McLaughlin, and he reproduced a number of these photographs of various scenes. This is actually a scene from one of the most famous battles of the time, the battle at Gettysburg on the 3rd of July in 1863, where about 51,000 casualties occurred. Gardner, O'Sullivan, James Gibson were there on the 5th of July. And one of the most famous pictures of this series that they took of Gettysburg is this one called "The Home of the Rebel Sharpshooter." What you're looking at is a heavily manipulated scene. It purports to be on the first look as the kind of den of a rebel sharpshooter who has been killed. He's in, if you follow my cursor, it's a little hard to see in these smaller photographs, but he's in the foreground a little bit off to the right here. And then you see this rifle that is propped up here, purporting to be the rifle that would be used by the rebel sharpshooter. But here's the thing, it's a Springfield musket. You can tell by looking at it, and that was something used by the North. It is not the Sharps rifle used by the rebel sharpshooters at the time. So this is heavily posed here. It's a nice balanced composition. It's got, you know, setting up the scene of the details of the rocks against the death and so forth. And when it was actually shown, when this picture was actually shown, it actually turned up at the end of the war, as so many of these pictures that you'll be seeing did, in a famous limited folio book created by Gardner called the Photographic Sketchbook of the War. Again, this was all the pictures were almost 7 by almost 9 inches. They were albumin silver prints, tipped in and accompanied by text of this, so that when you saw this scene, the text that accompanied it, which, think about this, it basically encodes this image, is Gardner's own kind of narrative about it. It says, quote, that his suffering must have been intense. What visions of loved ones far away may have hovered about his stony pillow. Then the text skips ahead 4 months and transmits the ultimate fate of a rebel. Quote, the skeleton of the soldier lay undisturbed within a moldering uniform. None of those who went up and down the fields to bury the fallen has found him. Missing was all that could have known of him at the time, at home, and some mother may yet be patiently waiting and watching for the return of her boy, whose bones lie bleaching, unrecognized and alone between the rocks at Gettysburg. Now think of that. You know, on the one hand, we look at these things and you think, wow, this is a documentation of what actually happened. And in some ways, you know, it is. People were killed. I'm sure sharpshooters were killed. But the nuances that are in this are all fabrication. They're all codes. They come from the standpoint, first of all, of a northerner who is, you know, intending to make the North's position more moral and more acceptable than the South. But it also laments in this way and tugs on our heartstrings the death of this soldier who, you know, hasn't been found 4 months gone by, whose parents are wondering where he is, and all of those things. It adds this heartfelt story. What I'm trying to get at is that in our historical distance from these things, oftentimes we will look at them and just, you know, without knowing the facts behind the reproduction of this image, its consumption, the way that it was fabricated in the first place, we'll just accept these as documentary records of something that actually occurred when they aren't at all, or they aren't in any uncomplicated way. So to look at a few more of these, again by Alexander Gardner. This is Confederate dead in the sunken road at Antietam battlefield. These are incredibly graphic images, right? And there's no way these were going to be reproduced in newspapers of the time. So they were held on to and primarily reproduced in this photographic sketchbook of the war. Notice how we're looking at just the Confederate and not the Union dead here. Notice as well that there's a certain selective focus on the dead themselves, and because the figures in the upper right corner were moving, they're a little bit blurred out in the scene, making us think about the dead as well as those who are looking in on the scene. Maybe even an indication, because people would have been familiar with this, of Lincoln in his ever-present top hat. Again, soldiers on the battlefield at Antietam, the first major conflict of the war that Gardner was at. 1862, once again, all of these soldiers dead, almost without exception. He would picture the Southerners here, because this was for a Northern audience. Another photographer associated with Alexander Gardner and sent out in the field was John Reiki. This is one of his most famous photographs, called A Burial Party from Cold Harbor, Virginia, 1865. In this case, again, you can probably tell it's a very composed picture. He spent a lot of time putting all of these skeletal remains on this makeshift gurney here, and selectively focusing on that in the foreground so as to show the gruesomeness of this scene. In the background and off to the left of this picture are freed slaves who are doing the work of burying the dead. Again, these would have been accompanied with text in Alexander Gardner's limited folio edition of the photographic sketchbook of the war. One of the most famous photographers in our story today in this lecture is Timothy O'Sullivan. Timothy O'Sullivan really is famous for creating pictures like this, these broad, wide view, maximum depth of field lenses pictures of the Civil War. Rather than the very carefully composed scenes that we've seen so far, Timothy O'Sullivan was famous for basically trying to capture as much detail as he could in a single photograph. Half of the photographs in Gardner's sketchbook of the war were Timothy O'Sullivan's, including this famous picture called A Harvest of Death from Gettysburg. Again, take a close look at this. Think about this next to the other photographs. We are having, while we focus in on one dead in the center of the picture, the kind of way that he has set the lens of the camera so that he can capture this depth of field and give you more information rather than just a tight selective focus on one thing necessarily, is important here. Now there is a selective focus on, of course, the close-up here, but you get all of this other information as well, which was the hallmark of his photography. When this was reproduced in the photographic sketchbook of the war, some of the heroism goes right out of this. As your textbook says, the veneer of war pageantry and matter-of-fact reports are removed, and the quote that accompanied this was, quote, "The rebels represented in the photograph are without shoes. These were always removed from the feet of the dead on account of the pressing need of the survivors. The pockets are turned inside out also to show that appropriation did not cease with the covering of the feet. Around is scattered the litter of battlefield, accoutrement, ammunitions, rags, cups, canteens, crackers, haversacks, and letters that may tell the name of the owner, although the majority will surely be buried by unknown by strangers, and in a strange land. They paid with life the price of their treason, and when the wicked strife was finished, found nameless graves far from home kindred." Right? So once again, this is a work that is, on the one hand, you would look at it on its own and you would think of it maybe in a particular way. And the breadth of meaning that could be here is pretty wide open. But then you think about the way that these things were distributed, how they were accompanied by this text, and slowly the meaning keeps getting more and more formed by the ideology of the producers of these images. Field where General Reynolds fell. This is a pretty interesting photograph. Once again, Timothy O'Sullivan. So selective focus on the figures in the foreground, but a wide field of vision on this. Notice how, and this will become kind of his hallmark, how there's no sky shown, or very little sky, in a Timothy O'Sullivan work, so he doesn't have to do composite printing of that overexposed sky. In this picture, General Reynolds isn't to be seen. He is already exited the scene. He's already been carried off. And so it's meant to be a kind of melancholy scene of that is a reminder of where this great general died, but doesn't actually show you that great general himself, just is acknowledged by the war dead here. There are many scenes as well that show you, the generals and their staff in between battles, such as General Grant here and his general staff sitting around kind of maybe planning for the next event to occur. George Bernard was another photographer who is primarily associated with, first of all, he had his own studio in Oswego, New York, and then he moved to New York City in 1859. He worked with Brady's portrait studios and then was a part of the Civil War, started with Brady and moved on to Gardner. He primarily, though, was associated with William Tecumseh Sherman and the destruction of Atlanta and his march south. His photographic views of Sherman's campaign, he produced a limited edition folio of these. 100 different copies were produced. It was $100 to buy this, which is a very high price at the time, from 61 different pictures printed in a 10 by 14 format, which was the size of his large plates at the time. So before he even went to the Civil War, he was famous for capturing scenes of destruction, such as this scene of the burning mills in Oswego, New York. Then he goes off to the war and produces some of these famous photographs, such as this one called The Hell Hole in New Church, Jersey, in Georgia. Now, remember, he's working with Sherman, and Sherman's march to Atlanta was a scorched earth policy. He just destroyed everything that he found, went out of his way to terrorize people. And as I said before, even today, if you end up in Atlanta or South Carolina and you're around the wrong people, don't start talking about William Tecumseh Sherman. To be sure, they still hate him there for what he did. And the destruction was immense. So when you look at the scene, you don't see a ton of dead. There are a few, if you were to see this in person, you might see a few guns here and there. But what you're seeing are all of these destroyed trees that are the aftermath of a horrible battle, and these trees have all been destroyed by artillery fire and gunfire and so forth. So it's a scene of the destruction, the catastrophe that accompanied the battle without any of the bodies being shown here. One of his most famous photographs is the scene of General McPherson's death from around 1864. He basically, in this scene, composed symbols to show you death without actually showing the body of the person himself. In other words, if you look here in the foreground, let's say this is where General McPherson died, and it's not clear that he did die here. Basically, all he's done is shown you a horse skull and some bones over here. There are some strewn shell casings in various places, explosive shot and so forth, but he doesn't show you the actual death. I think, as most commentators have put it, he's trying to shy away a little bit from showing you the gruesomeness of the war in some of these pictures, believing that they'll be more sellable than actual documents of the fallen dead. So that's in the back of his mind here. The ruins of the railway depot in Charleston. Once again, this scorched earth campaign. Look at the destruction caused by Sherman here. Everything's just been blown to smithereens. All the bodies have been cleared away at this point, but the remnants, the ruins of this campaign are what he's focusing on here. Destruction of Hood's Ordinance, same thing, right? Sherman would come in, he'd blast an area, he'd move the Southern troops out of that area, and then he would dynamite everything, burn everything down, just scorched earth policy. And the works here by George Bernard show you some of that. What I find really interesting about this photograph is, again, it's this it's not quite a panoramic view, but it's got this wide focus on just about everything that you can fit into the scene. And by the way, yes, he is combination printing this so that he can get clouds in here. But right in the center of this whole scene is a silhouette of a man amidst all of this destruction, and right in the center, right? So a very carefully composed picture that makes us think about, how this man in the scene might be contemplating the destruction he is in the midst of. It almost looks like a ghostly figure, those dead who are no longer here. It's a very carefully composed type of narrative. Another component of the Civil War pictures are a series of photographs that were created by what was called the Army Medical Museum in order to document the war wounds that were inflicted by primarily musket fire at the time, so as to help doctors to deal with these types of injuries. In other words, William Bell, who's the head of this, would take photographs of people who were damaged by the war with various injuries, and a compendium, or almost kind of a dictionary of all the different types of war wounds, could be compiled to help doctors refer to those so as to create better treatments, artificial limbs, and so forth. So this is just a photograph showing you the Civil War surgeons by Mathew Brady. They are going to draw upon these photographs, such as this one by, again, William Bell, of a man who was shot through the femur. And you see the way that this photograph works is that, they show you the war wound here in the front, and then they've set him up against a mirror so you can see where it went through in the back. And a doctor or surgeon could refer to this as well as the notes that went along with the treatment program, the surgery conditions, and learn from these photographs. So a more scientific application, a kind of documentation of these war wounds themselves. He also, of course, like many of these, I didn't show you many of these images, would supposedly document the dead, in this case, a man killed by Native Americans, supposedly, although under what conditions we'll never know. So let's pause here for a minute. Give me a second. I'll be right back. You'll see very little, but I need to take a quick break. So I'd like to turn now to a different kind of documentation that was occurring in photography starting in the middle of the 19th century all the way through the beginning of the 20th century, which is the documentation of using photography of natural wonders. And I'll just quickly go through a few of these. I've made mention of this before when we were talking about the stereoscope and the stereograph being used, as Oliver Wendell Holmes put it, in order to allow you to travel to places that you otherwise might not be able to physically travel to. For instance, George Wilson Bridges, he went through various parts of the world to document some of these great wonders of the time, such as the Sphinx. Notice how he captions this, the Sphinx noon, January 15th, 1851, so you feel like you're really there, that Bart's idea of the punctum, or actually traveling to see the scene itself, which people could buy, again, as in limited folios. They could buy as stereographic images, or they could just get cartes, carte de visite, of these scenes and imagine themselves being there. It was a fairly lucrative trade for quite a while. Felix Thénard was another who would show you Egypt, which was all the craze in the middle of the 19th century, after all, the columns at Karnak here. Or Francis Frith's The Pyramids at Dashur, 1858. Again, scenes of the world that you had heard about, that painters and engravers had reproduced, but the photographic detail could make you feel like you were actually there. Most of what I want to show you, though, here is the representation of the natural wonders of North America produced by United States photographers. And I want to attach this, again, to questions about documentaries, because, of course, that's the way people have been thinking about photographs at the time, not necessarily using that term, but believing that what they were seeing was a kind of objective record of these natural wonders in the United States. So we'll start with George Barker's Niagara in Summer from Below, 1888. Now, Niagara Falls was a very popular destination. It already was a tourist destination for people at this time. It was one of those incredible natural wonders that the United States wanted to show off to the rest of the world. One of the key ideas that Salman Godot in that essay wants to point out is that photographs on the one hand can be documents or objective records of some kind of scene, but those scenes, the subject matter itself, is already heavily coded. It already means something in advance to the actual capturing of the scene, of the record of the scene by a photograph. So when you look at something like Niagara Falls, what people would have been thinking about is ideas about American nationalism in particular. One of those ideas is that, one of the things that separated the United States as a new fledgling nation from the rest of Europe is that we had boundless, endless, pristine landscape, right? And this pristine landscape meant a lot of things to the American public. One of the things that it meant was beauty. This was the final frontier. It was God's land. It was something that we had in abundance, which a lot of Europe had used up. In the midst of the Industrial Revolution, the natural landscape was fast disappearing from other parts of the world, but we had endless amounts of it. Think of, for instance, when I'm using the term nationalism, how many of our kind of national songs like America the Beautiful and others really focus on landscape and how beautiful this world is to us. So, here you have a record of this. If you think about the major painting form in the 19th century, it was American landscape painting, and it was, again, something that was understood and had meaning in relation to the belief systems of the time. I'll just show you one painting from this time period, a painting by Asher B. Durand called Kindred Spirits, which is a memorial to William Cullen Bryant and Thomas Cole. William Cullen Bryant, of course, being the poet and author, and Thomas Cole being one of the most famous landscape painters of the time. Here standing next to each other on this promontory in the midst of the American wilderness, discussing the moral implications of pristine landscape. So, before we get into the photographs themselves, many of which were produced by the U.S. Geological Survey in order to document what America had, let's talk of some of the ways that the American landscape, meaning the North American landscape, was understood at the time. The first of the key terms that I have on the screen in front of you is pantheism, or pantheistic. Pantheism is meant here to refer to the belief that God, and again, we're early America, so most people are Christian at this time, was inherent in nature. Or another way to put this is that the belief was that our world and the pristine natural landscape was a manifestation of the divine. This came from Romantic beliefs about the idea that nature is the cradle of moralism, that in the midst of the beauty of the natural landscape, you're kind of surrounded by the spirit of God that will show you the right way. that big cities, cosmopolitan centers, and so forth have lost touch with the natural world and are more about man and could lead people into, let's say, non-moralistic positions. And it comes from a fairly mystical belief that God created the world as he created us, and therefore something of his divine energy or spirit is inherent in the natural world itself. The idea of pantheism showed up all over the place at the time. One of the big places is in the transcendentalist philosophy of people like Ralph Waldo Emerson, who said that in many places, including his famous treatise Nature, that the landscape is a manifestation of the divine that will create a moral compass for humanity if they only follow it. Pantheism is a belief also turned up in sermons of the time, even inaugural addresses by presidents. It was everywhere. And again, because the United States, and at this point we're talking, middle of the century, is primarily the East Coast, and the first major trips out to the West are starting to occur at this time. The United States is primarily unblemished, pristine landscape. That just meant to people that it was filled with God. And therefore, if you pictured that unblemished landscape, you're actually kind of capturing the essence of God in the landscape around us. Another major term of this time is the term the sublime. Now, the sublime, and we use this all the time today to just mean things that are really good or great. This ice cream is sublime or something like that, actually comes from philosophy. And it kind of entered the scene with a Scottish philosopher by the name of Edmund Burke, who said that the sublime is a manifestation of something that inspires awe in us. It's huge and vast. It makes us feel this kind of contradictory feeling. On the one hand, we feel small as human beings and minuscule in the presence of something that is so massive and powerful and grand, such as huge mountains or the ocean or the endless, boundless sky. But on the other hand, this conflicting emotion also carried with it a feeling of exhilaration and power in that we felt connected to this overwhelming power of the universe around us. Another philosopher who made this a little bit more complex was the famous German philosopher Immanuel Kant. And Immanuel Kant, the best way to describe the sublime from him is by juxtaposing it with what he called the beautiful. The beautiful for Kant was, it was a subjective experience of the world around us and of art in which the human mind is structured, according to Kant, in a particular way as to take pleasure in particular types of order in the universe. And when it comes across that order in the universe, it feels pleasure. The sublime, on the other hand, are these moments of time, according to Kant, in which we glimpse a kind of order of magnitude or a magnitude of order that so far exceeds the possibility of human mentation or human comprehension or apprehension that all we can do is understand that there is this massive, powerful order that exists beyond us that we will never comprehend, but that nonetheless exists out there. Now, the best way I know how to explain this is again through Christian theology. Christians believe that God is infinitely complex and infinitely grand. They don't believe that you can understand God in all of his complexity. Every once in a while, though, you can intuit, in a sense, that God exists in the universe. You can see something of his order in the universe, but you know that you'll never be able to grasp it in its immensity. That is the experience of the sublime. And again, it carries this contradictory type of experience. On the one hand, you feel small and minuscule. Your brain isn't powerful enough to understand the complexity of God. And on the other hand, you're comforted and exhilarated into realizing that you've witnessed or intuited the presence of God in the universe around you. again, if you take this out of Christian terms, it's the experience many of us who love nature get when, let's say, you stand at the edge of the ocean and you smell the ocean and you see how huge and vast it is, and all of the power of the tides and of waves, and part of you feels no ability to control that nature, and the other part of you witnesses its incredible power and feels some kind of exhilaration in that. Or another way to put it would be to say, the sublime is oftentimes invoked by children without their knowing. It's those questions that kids ask that, we at some point kind of give up on asking later on in life, such as, every child seems to ask the question, where does space end, or where does the sky end? It's boundless. There's no way for us to even comprehend the idea of infinite space. We don't even have the terms to make sense of it. And yet we know there must be some kind of answer to that question. But what is it, right? What is the sublime? What is the answer to the question of the infinite nature of space? Our puzzling over that might instill in us the experience of the sublime. The final major term here that can't be passed over kind of combines a bunch of these ideas together: manifest destiny. Now, manifest destiny is a term that was coined in the middle of the 19th century, but the idea had been around for a long time, and most of us know a little bit of this. Manifest destiny is the belief that it is our not only right, but our God-given duty to extend over North America, to convert the native peoples, and to use the land that God has given us for our own prospering. Manifest destiny starts with the belief that this world was given to a particular culture, white Christian culture, and that we are, in terms of kind of a social Darwinism, on the extreme edge of evolution, whereas other peoples are far behind us. And it's our duty to go out into this landscape and make use of the natural resources that God has given us, make use of the land, make use of the minerals, the timber, the space itself, in order to prosper and to do this despite the fact that this land is already populated by native peoples out there. It gives us this sense not only of a right, but a duty to make use of this landscape. So let's look at some of these photographs. We'll return first off to Timothy O'Sullivan, who we've encountered earlier in this lecture as one of the photographers first working under Brady and then under Alexander Gardner, taking pictures of the Civil War. Timothy O'Sullivan was first hired by Clarence King and his expedition to do geological explorations of the 40th parallel in the United States. And he was really interested, as on a personal level, in the idea of the sublime. Timothy O'Sullivan trekked out, as all of these people did, into the vast, unblemished landscape as frontiersmen. This is a term that John Sarkowski uses a lot, the frontier mentality of these photographers. They're a little bit like pioneers in their own way, who in the American kind of mythology, our own kind of mindset, pioneers were these heroic figures that went out and tamed the wilderness, or at least put it to use for the rest of society. And someone like Timothy O'Sullivan and the rest that you'll see were their own type of pioneers, going out there through their own hard work and heroic actions and taking pictures of scenes and bringing them back to others who hadn't seen them yet. Now, there's reasons for this. Part of it is to document what America has, to document what is out there to be put to use, what is beautiful out there in the West. Some of these things were, almost all of them were paid for either the U.S. Geological Survey, in other words, the U.S. government, or by even railway companies who wanted to entice people out to the West because they needed workforces out there. And so there is a vested interest in these photographs. This is, again, Timothy O'Sullivan's basically photographic van out there in the midst of the desert sand hills near the Sink of Carson in Nevada in 1867. Timothy O'Sullivan, again, interested in the sublime. You can see that here. He's best known for these pictures that have an abundance of photographic detail. He's using the wet plate process. Later on, he'll be able to use the dry plate process. This is the Shoshone Falls in Idaho. So these beautiful, beautiful falls, the power of and beauty of the natural world. If you were able to see this up close, his photographs are fairly large size by the standards of the day. You would see an abundance of photographic detail, all of the little crags of the rock faces, even down to the bark on trees. But of course the water is flowing, and so it all kind of blurs into this almost mystical emanation of God and pantheism. Timothy O'Sullivan also had a relatively ingenious way of dealing with the problem of the sky. Remember that if you took a photograph of landscape, usually if you left that exposure time where it should be to give you all the details of the landscape, the sky would be overexposed and thus just turn into kind of whiteness. And so what he would do is basically either not show you any sky at all, or use the sky in a very small way, as you see here, just to help emphasize the linear quality of the contours of the hills up above. This is another typical picture by O'Sullivan, the ancient ruins in the Canyon de Chelly in New Mexico. These are ancient ruins of Native American peoples here. And what do you get from this? I mean, what are you really seeing? Not only are you getting a documentation of what something looks like, you're getting the natural beauty of the world rendered in all of the photographic detail that frankly only photography can give at this point. The painters of this time could never give you this detail, could never really paint all of the different crags and textures of the rocks and all these wonderful different tonalities that can be pictured here. Now, one of the reasons that Timothy O'Sullivan got so famous is that people like John Sarkowski thought of him as the preeminent kind of originator, before the term was even kind of brought into existence, of art for art's sake or formalist types of photography. In other words, Timothy O'Sullivan, for people like Sarkowski, wasn't really documenting various subject areas or scenes in the American landscape so much as he was using those subjects to produce beautiful photographs of textures and line and tonal differentiation that were, beautiful just as aesthetic objects. Another Timothy O'Sullivan, you're starting to see, a pretty standard way of working. Very well, exposed photographs of the natural textures of the landscape, limited uses of the sky. Usually something is placed in these photographs, and you probably noticed these in the others. This is a little figure down below in order to imply the scale of the scene that you're looking at. One of the things that landscape photographers could do that frankly photographers couldn't do is they could paint on grand scales. Now later on we'll see some mammoth prints, 20 by 30 inch plates that were produced to create larger high fidelity photographs, but even 20 by 30 is nothing like an Albert Bierstadt painting that might be 10 by 14 feet big. And so when you're dealing with a small format, you need something to establish the scale of that format, and including a figure in these scenes can really emphasize that. For whatever reason, and I include this in here, this is one of those photographs that John Sarkowski really loved of Timothy O'Sullivan's work. It's called Inscription Rock in New Mexico. The ruler has been added in here to give you a sense of the scale. It's got a little inscription here, and what Zarkowski loves so much about this, and by the way, it started, frankly, with people like Alfred Stieglitz pointing to this photograph and saying it's just this incredibly interesting photograph, is that while on the one hand it would seem to be a document of a very particular thing, using even the ruler, what it is also is a beautiful combination of form. And what I mean by that is that you've got this beautiful cursive inscription on the rock, juxtaposed with the very linear quality of the ruler itself. You've got the kind of washed out texture of that rock against the much darker tonalities of the foliage in the foreground. You've got this kind of combination of forms that is very pleasing, just as a kind of aesthetic photograph. William Henry Jackson is maybe the epitome of the heroic kind of frontiersman when it comes to 19th, early 20th century nature photography. Once again, he was a member of the U.S. Geological and Geographical Survey of the Territories. He was their official photographer from 1870 to 79. He even worked with the painter Thomas Moran on composition so that he could get from this painter some techniques of how to create more pleasing compositions. He's much more picturesque than you get from O'Sullivan. In other words, he tries to imbue his scenes not with just detail, but with some kind of attitude. Most of his fame came from photographing some pretty famous sites in Yellowstone. So here he is with the U.S. Geological Survey team in Red Buttes, Wyoming. Henry Jackson is standing at the far right, 1870. Again, they're going to document what is out there, and but first for the government, but also for the rest of the world to see what is actually in the American West and all of its beauty and all of these ideas that we want to connect this to. Idea of the presence of God in that pristine nature, the pantheistic, the idea of the sublime, this ever boundless power of God in the universe around us, as well as, of course, documenting all of these beautiful natural resources that can be put to use and that support the idea of manifest destiny. What I wanted to show you here is, how difficult it would have been to do what he did. He worked with a very large format camera, huge what were called mammoth plates at the time. These are giant glass negatives that were up to 20 by 24 inches in dimension here. Imagine then traipsing to the places that he is traipsing. There's no roads here, right? So he's out using a donkey here to carry his photographic materials to capture these scenes. Oftentimes, he's got on his back in some of these areas that he's going to. He's having to climb mountains. Around 200 pounds of photographic material. After all, glass plates are not, without their weight. He also documented Native Americans, and we'll come back to this in more detail when we look in particular at Edward Curtis's work. So, Red Cloud, Little Big Man, famous King Red Cloud Sioux. This is another member of the team, James A. Garfield, documenting the Native American people of the time. He produced both these mammoth plates as well as stereographic images. This gives you a sense of what these mammoth plates looked like. This is a broken one, of course, but huge glass negatives with abundance of detail here. So what did he get famous for picturing? Again, primarily Yellowstone. So this is the hot springs and Castle Geyser at Yellowstone, still around today in a mammoth print here. Pulpit Rock in Echo Canyon, Utah. So the beauty of this landscape. You can see the figures off to the right-hand side establishing the scale. The Canyon of the Grand River in Utah from 1885. Pikes Peak from the Garden of the Gods, 1888, panoramic image. And then one of his most famous accomplishments, there had been stories brought back forever of the Mountain of the Holy Cross in Colorado. And painters had painted this, but you know, paintings can be fictive. Photographs supposedly never lies. What was so famous about this Mountain of the Holy Cross is that because of the crags in the mountain, as you can see here, it makes this huge mountain look like it's got a cross in it, which is, for most people, a manifestation of the idea of pantheism and of the sublime. God is inherent in nature, and here is a sign of him being inherent in nature. Now, he had to traipse up another mountain, get it at exactly the right time where the snow is melted enough to show you this cross, get the perfect photograph of this on these mammoth plates. And again, he wouldn't know that he got the photograph right. He would have to take this back and develop it before he knew whether the negative was, viable or not. So it was this huge undertaking to get, let's say, documentary evidence that this really did exist. Again, more stereographs of, in this case, the mud puffs in the lower Firehole Basin that I believe I showed you before. The canyon of the Colorado, Grand Canyon, of course, became and has always been one of these great wonders of North America. Here, once again, he has a selective focus on all of the detail of the foreground here, this incredible formation of rocks, and then a little bit softer focus off into the distance of the enormity of the Grand Canyon, with the figures in the middle of the photographs establishing the scale. Again, I just wanted to show you some of these. This is the first time people are seeing on the East Coast photographs of these natural wonders. And once again, they would have just started to see paintings of this. Paintings of the American West start with people like Albert Bierstadt traveling out in the middle of the century to see the American West for the first time and painting pictures of it. But it's not till these photographs come back that anyone has kind of confirmation that that's really what is out there in the American West. But again, documentations in what way? He picks very particular scenes. He, of course, photographs them in particular light conditions, and they are encoded by belief systems in pantheism, in the sublime, in our God-given duty to go out and make use of the natural resources and beauty of the American West, and so forth. Canyon of the Yellowstone, Mammoth Hot Springs in the lower basin, looking up from Yellowstone. Oh, what a beautiful photograph, right? Hell's Gate in Colorado. Notice how many times the trains are shown in these scenes. When you see train tracks traveling across the American West, whereas today we might lament the fact that that pristine landscape has been blemished by the incurrence of mankind, at the time this was an indication of American manifest destiny, of Americans putting to use their scientific knowledge of technology, their hard work and labor to make use of the natural resources that are out there in the West. After all, you needed these rail lines in order to bring back timber, which was the initial major industry of the time, and then later on various minerals and so forth. In Quartz Mill near Virginia City, this is putting to use again the natural resources of the time, basically a fledgling factory used to bring minerals and frankly even gold out of this area. And then the beauty of these iconic American landscape features, Giants Club. Just, again, if you ever get a chance to see these firsthand, what you're losing in these slide lectures is all the photographic detail. And you have to kind of transport yourself back to this time to understand what this would have meant to people of the time to be seeing for the first time confirmation beliefs that they had held dear for years through the mechanism of photography. Now we turn to a tricky question. Edward S. Curtis, a local photographer, by the way, who got famous for his depictions of Native Americans. And you'll read all about the mythology of how he got started, getting his camera, of course, and eventually being caught up in the interest in capturing Native Americans before their way of life disappeared. He is, in a sense, a part of what the famous cultural philosopher James Clifford once called the salvage paradigm. Near the end of the 19th century, years after Native Americans had started to be carted off to reservations, and of course we have already gone through the Indian Wars that kind of ended any type of really traditional Native ways of life in their native homelands. People started to really lament these people that for years they had, on the one hand, romanticized. After all, these were very exotic people in our world, but also, had marginalized, had been quite racist about, had, more often than not gone out of their way to harm in order that white culture in the United States could prosper. What I'm getting at here is near the end of the 19th century, when it was very clear that the white culture had won, that Native Americans' way of kind of pre-contact, pre-colonial life was fast disappearing. Both cultural anthropologists, painters, and photographers tried to document that way of life before it entirely disappeared. And one of the most famous of these is Edward Curtis. Now, his photographs, are erstwhile documents. You should know right off the bat that Curtis was very well intentioned. He professed a deep love and admiration for Native American peoples. His aspiration was to document as many of these people and their culture as he could before they disappeared. But of course, he documented them according to his own belief systems, very romantic belief systems. Native Americans, for instance, had been, of course, in contact with white culture for hundreds of years by this point, had adopted, many of their tools, their styles of dress combined with their own styles of dress. In other words, they have been partially westernized. Now, Edward Curtis doesn't want to see any of that, or very little of that, in his photographs, and so he oftentimes would travel around with suitcases and chest filled with various types of authentic Native American clothing and ceremonial garb and various artifacts that he would dress up Native Americans in and then take his photographs of them. So, they are pictures of Native American peoples, but it's not as if they're in their traditional garb or that he's trying to document their actual way of life. He is submitting his way of thinking about them in these photographic records. Now, here's a portrait of him in 1899. And here's, a Squamish woman, so Northwest Coast native, with a blanket. What he tends to do is a very, very soft focus portrait of these people. He, again, they may or may not have been wearing the clothes that you see them in here. He would always go out of his way to try to get them into traditional Native American type of clothes. If they had anything Western on them, he would try to avoid that. He would absolutely have them dress up in any kind of ceremonial garb, such as you see here. This has led to a lot of consternation concerning these photographs by anthropologists and cultural historians today on a couple of different grounds. Number one is that he exoticizes them even further. He doesn't show them as they existed in their day-to-day life, but rather only in their ceremonial garb. And number two, many of the photographs that he took of these people in various ceremonial garb, you're not supposed to see as a Westerner. Many, many ceremonies are only intended for the initiated, and many of the artifacts that and masks and garb that you'll be seeing, not so much in the photographs I'm showing you. I'm trying to stay away from most of those. In an Edward Curtis photograph are something that we're not supposed to be seeing, that we should be respecting, their belief system, and that only the initiated or members of the tribe should be able to see these ceremonies. Before the stone, the Apache here. Once again, look at how romanticized this is, that he sets our viewpoint way down low and shoots them up above. If this looks suspiciously like a spaghetti western with Native Americans kind of disappearing off into the landscape, it's because, it comes from that same set of beliefs. This would have been taken as, an image of Native Americans and their way of life fast disappearing, kind of disappearing into the landscape. You don't ever see photographs of Native Americans actually entering the city in an Edward Curtis photograph, for instance. And the metaphors that are being drawn out about this of a disappearing race by having them kind of, again, disappear into the landscape is something that you see in a lot of his photographs. So they partake of the beliefs of the time. Again, like this, the Canyon de Chelly Navajo people. Does this not look to many of you like some kind of Western movie that would take its cues from photographs by Edward Curtis here? Juxtaposing these Native American people seen from far off, riding horses against the landscape behind them that they were being pushed off of course. They weren't being allowed to live in their ancestral homes, but were rather being placed on reservations. Close-ups of Native Americans, portraits of these people in ceremonial traditional garb, as you see in these pictures. Again, costume of a woman shaman, coat from 1915. It may or may not be the case that this is a type of garb that this shaman would have wanted shown to Western audiences. And of course, all of these were reproduced in a folio called The North American Indian that came out in multiple volumes, thousands of pictures by Curtis. One of his most controversial projects was the production of a very early film that was originally titled In the Land of the Headhunters. Now, this is about Northwest Coast peoples, and we don't have a whole lot of headhunters out here. So that was meant to exoticize them even further and to, of course, capture an audience about these exotic people that were out on the prowl hunting, to kill white men, I suppose, is what he was trying to get at. Trying to play up the idea of exoticism. This is a film still from that. The film was later retitled In the Land of the War Canoes, and was premiered in Washington here. So here's the filming in progress. Curtis at the camera in the foreground here, and George Hunt, who is the director, off to the left in 1914. It's heavily directed. As a matter of fact, most of the scenes that you would see in this work are not very accurate to the types of ceremonies that were performed natively by these people. Close to home, right? It was premiered at the Moore Theater. In the Land of the Headhunters was what it was first called, and then they reproduced this. Look at the captioning here too. A drama of primitive life on the shores of the North Pacific. Primitive peoples, that's a key watchword of this time. Primitive in the sense that they're, like in the scheme of social Darwinism, behind white culture, and therefore their time is quick passing, so catch them while you can. Again, just some more of these scenes. Almost always, again, Native Americans shown in ways that don't directly evidence their contact with the West. No Western clothing, no Western housing, no Western tools, no Western rifles even here. But then, in this scene, the motor car next to the tent, this is the way that he would get around. Why he took this photograph is anyone's guess, but what it seems to say, if we think about this according to the cultural codes of the time, is on the one hand the teepee, the housing of Native Americans par excellence, at least according to Western culture, which of course most of you know, teepees were only used by Plains Indians, next to a symbol of white culture's technological progress. One culture is doomed to go into the past, to disappear, and the other culture is in ascendancy. It's a way to put into visual form our own, cultural superiority. Again, I just wanted to show you a few more of these. In this case, he does have someone wearing a Western jacket, but he has probably dressed him up in this feathered headset. Think about Edward Curtis's work next to Adam Clark Vroman's work, which you'll read about more in your textbook. Vroman lived with the people that you're going to see him picturing, primarily Hopi descendants. And he didn't shy away from showing them as they actually looked. He absolutely didn't ask them to dress up. He showed them as he found them. So notice here, Western garb, even a erstwhile Western almost haircut, and just one indication of Native American kind of traditions, that necklace. He showed you the Hopi towns along one of these mesas. These are townships that go all the way back into prehistory that continued to be inhabited, or at least some of them did. And here's his depiction of Native American people. Now think a little bit about this. Here's how he found them. This is what they looked like at the time. What do you think about the difference between the way that Curtis pictured these people and the way that Vroman pictured these people? Is one more controversial, more problematic, and if so, from what standpoint? Now, I'm not saying these are pure documentaries. After all, he is picking people, he's showing them in particular locales. These also are going to be distributed and consumed in a very particular way according to belief systems that were already in existence at the time. But does it matter that he showed them having already had contact with Western culture and adopting some of their traditions? What I'm getting at here is what happens when we as Westerners represent another people as we want to see them versus how we find them? What happens when we show them and see them wearing clothing that they have adopted from us, or combining various traditions of their own traditional culture with our culture? And what I would say is that one thing that occurs is that we see them as a living culture responding to the historical circumstances in both positive and problematic ways, rather than seeing them as a people who are only tied to their traditional past and are dying out or are a doomed race. So a few more of these pictures by Vroman. This is the Governor Trujillo with his family of 6 in the center here. Again, Western and Native traditions combined here, versus something like Curtis. The ceremonies, not posed. He's not constructing these. He's not saying roll, film, cut, and so forth. He's just taking photographs of the ceremony of the corn dance as it unfolded. And then this glorious picture. I've always wondered, so there's the Hopi maiden with the squash blossom hair dress. This is a very famous type of hairstyle. Look at this great photograph. It's traditional stuff on the one hand, but again, in combination with all the other photographs you've seen, you don't get the sense of people who are locked in their moment of pre-colonial contact, but are actually being depicted as he finds them. I've always kind of wondered whether Princess Leia took her hairstyle cues from this tradition. In any case, I hope you've had fun with this lecture. This is, from this point forward, for me, kind of trudged our way through a lot of technical stuff in the first couple of weeks, and this is where things get very interesting. So stay tuned for the next installment.